Two lectures you heard this morning are very simple. You have a brain. It does something to instantiate consciousness that we then call a mind, and that mind then engages you psychosocially with others. So by understanding some of those neurobiological mechanisms, we're not going to take a purely reductive approach, although certainly I think it's important to use some form of intertheoretical reductions to be able to perhaps look at certain psychological variables in terms of those neurobiological constituents, etc. What we also have to recognize is the arrows go in both directions. That we have to be able to take the biological information and embed that and nest that within the realities of the psychosocial communities in which humans find themselves, hierarchically, both at their own species and other species. And the issue then becomes, what does the nature of that ecology really mean? Ecology, in this sense, meaning housekeeping. We'll talk a little bit more about that after we come back from the break. But I think that the hanging question then becomes, if we understand the way neurobiological mechanisms help organisms to parse different cognitions and emotions into values that may then substantiate, guide, direct, and even perhaps compel certain behaviors. And we recognize that those cognitions and emotions as neurobiological features may indeed be affected by things from the environment, inclusive of interactions with conspecifics, at a variety of levels of proximity, like me, not like me, other. And this can occur through direct physical interactions as well as the semantic interactions and iconic interactions of narratives that are increasingly then being utilized in a variety of different informational sources, for example, the web, images, etc. Then what we have to really do is we have to look back at that neuroscience and neurobiology and say, what does that neurobiology tell us about what it means to exist in that ecology, develop rules for the various niches that we may find ourselves in contact, out of contact. What does that mean for what we value and what we devalue? And how does that ecology in some way contribute to this thing that we, as a group, then call morality and codify to ethics? The project of neuroscience and neuroethics. Well, hopefully you enjoyed your cookies and coffee and a little networking outside. And you know, the way this actually works is I was talking to Karen, a colleague of mine, and she said, you know, this is sort of a little bit like trying to drink out of the fire hose. It comes at you fast and furious. And I said, yeah, but you know, the nice part about it is after you walk out of the room, you're still wet. And that's good, and that's what's supposed to happen. So we give you a soaking in here, and then we give you a little bit of caffeine, and then you let it all absorb. And then by that time, you start to talk to each other, and obviously, I also want to make the speakers available to each and all of you. So this is not just something where it's just pure didactic. Certainly, we're learning from the erudition of the august group of speakers we have here this morning. But I also really want to give you the opportunity to be very discursive, to speak with them. And then it gets, by the afternoon, a little dialectical. And that's the whole idea. So we give you a bunch of knowledge, then you can use it back at us by the end of the afternoon. That's when it gets really dangerous. So we spent the morning talking about the way brains may be operative in determining things like values, the way we may utilize particular Bayesian biases to determine how we make various decisions about what we hold emotionally dear and then make cognitive activities that influence our behavior. And of course, all of this is really beginning to ramp up to the what I call $25 million question that poses over the field of neuroscience and neuroethics. Can neuroscience in some way inform us enough about ourselves so as to be able to give us a tool that we can then task to say, does it help us to live a better life? Can we use neuroscience in some way in the larger dimensions that pose these philosophical questions to us that were predorable? How to live? What does the good mean? What does it mean to us? What is the basis of ethics? How should we get along with each other? What is the basis of human tension, conflict, aggression? And then are these things also available to us not only as accessible ideas, but also as accessible targets? Now, that's interesting because one of the things that you heard this morning is people referring to a variety of brain areas, and I love when neuroscientists do this. I do this all the time. We go, well, this brain area, we all succumb to something called a mereological fallacy. We all like to say, well, this brain area does that. Well, not really. That's sort of like saying, ask you the question, well, what part of the car drives? That's the way neuroscientists very often go about this. If I take the wheels off the car, you say, well, the car doesn't drive. Well, that's true. If I take the driver out of the car doesn't drive. Well, that's true. Take the transmission out. But I put them all together. And so one of the things we know is that there are, in fact, loci in the brain that do certain things. They function certain ways. One of the big missions these days is to utilize very advanced forms of electrical engineering to try to translate that literally from the level of the synapse all the way up to social behavior. That's clearly a major project for what we call Neurotechnology Futures 2020. Well, we'll parse that aside for the moment because I think the major question, the epistemological and perhaps ethical legal 800-pound gorilla in the room that's being fed and paid into this $25 million question of neuroscience is, what do we do with this? What does neuroscience teach us? And if we approach this field that has been somewhat nascent, but I'll argue in just a bit, has developed a significant canon, and as such, through its historicity, that canon I think is meaningful, then we approach the question you see here. What neuroscience perhaps can tell us about morality, and then the follow-up question, what should we do with some of this knowledge that we get? And what do we do about the knowledge that we don't have? This is not only a philosophical question, although I could leave it at that because our next speaker, I think, is most intimately associated with the pairing of those two terms, neuro and philosophy. Her book, Neurophilosophy, was indeed a testimonial in the field. And I think, in many ways, not only coined the term neurophilosophy, but generated a thrust of interest in how neuroscience could inform and be informed by the philosophical constructs of epistemology, anthropology, and then more broadly, ethics and perhaps metaphysics. Certainly she needs no introduction. I like to refer to Patricia and Paul Churchland as the first family of neurophilosophy, and in fact I think that title sticks. She is in fact Professor Emerita at University of California, San Diego, and is also at the Salk Institute. Please welcome Patricia Churchland.
Well, thank you, James, for your very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here and to have this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing. I should just mention that if we are seeking to retain information, what we really need is not a break with coffee, but a break with a nap. This is from the sleep lab at Harvard. So the question that motivates the research that I'm going to talk about today is the question of where values come from. And for much of my career, I didn't feel that I could really venture very far into the field of morality at all, because I basically felt I did not understand the way philosophers play that game. And that all changed, actually, when Bill Casebeer came to us as a graduate student and had some very interesting ideas about how to look at morality in a very fresh and very different way. And it was both very new, and it was also reached back to Aristotle, to Hume, to the pragmatists, and of course then to biology. So I will say a little bit, first of all, about some aspects of the history of the problem, and then the take on it. Now, what I'm going to say here is largely drawn from the book I published about a year ago called Brain Trust, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality, that came out of Princeton University Press. So it's always, of course, useful to see what Darwin has to say on this topic, and as most of you know, Darwin argued that our moral sense or conscience is really linked to three things: to a social instinct, to habits that are formed at once the organism is born and is able to take advantage of what's going on in the environment, and reason. And notice that this is really in contrast to how many people within the field of philosophy have tended to think about morality, where there is either an essentially Platonic idea, namely that there is a Platonic sort of semi-mystical realm in which inhere the great and deep moral truths, and that somehow by pure reason and intellection we are supposed to be able to grasp those truths. And of course that has certain obvious defects. And the other tradition much more recent tradition, owed largely, I guess, to Bentham, much less so, in fact, to Mill, sees utilitarianism as really essentially the only other alternative. And as we all know from freshman philosophy classes, utilitarianism, as a rule, has huge problems that any undergraduate can, in about 2 minutes, represent. Now, what has changed, I think, in the last 10 years is that whereas Darwin was really only to say we have social instincts, and of course we can see that there's something right about that, we can now say a little bit more in a neurobiological context about why we have those social instincts, and even a little bit about the circuitry and the neurotransmitters that support those social instincts. Moreover, because neuroscience has developed enormously over the last 20 years with regard to issues about learning, and in particular, how learning involves the reward system and hence involves feelings, emotions, positive and negative, we can now give a much deeper sense to the idea that habits are important. And thirdly, I think we're beginning to understand much more about reasoning than we did hitherto. Reasoning clearly is not, by and large, for most animals, including humans, is not a matter of constructing a syllogism. It's not a matter of deductive logic. What it is a matter of is something that I'll talk a little bit about towards the end. So to put this in context, and just to kind of remind you something about the evolutionary past, I rather like this now slightly dated diagram. On the vertical axis, we have years and millions. Horizontally, we have space. And we can see that there were many kinds of Homo before there were Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens have been around roughly, we think, 300,000, 250,000 years. Homo erectus, I think, is especially interesting. Homo erectus lasted a very long time. Homo erectus seems to have had a brain roughly 800 cc's, whereas yours is about 1,300 to 1,500 cc's. And Homo erectus was, of course, erect, walked on 2 feet, had fire, had stone tools, and also, as you can see from his spatial locations, got himself to Indonesia. And how were they able to do that? They built rafts. So Homo erectus was clearly a social animal. They lived in groups, as did all of these. And part of the reason I like to reflect on that, as well as on Homo sapiens for the first roughly 250,000 years on the planet, is that we had a social organization. We did not have a legal system. We almost certainly did not have anything resembling organized religion. And yet, like many small hunter-gatherer groups that we know about now, we had conflict resolution. We had ways of trading with others in an orderly fashion. We had ways of disciplining those within the group that threatened the stability of the group. And so I'm inclined to think then that when we put in context the fact that there are social humans of many kinds living in groups and organizing themselves to cooperate, that we have to be amazingly careful about taking our own intuitions about what's right and what's wrong and what could be and what couldn't be, and saying it applies to human nature in general. And I'm sorry to say that I think that there is still this very powerful tradition amongst evolutionary psychologists to sit in an armchair and say, I am so disgusted by, let's say, defecating amongst others, that I couldn't imagine that that isn't genetically hardwired. But of course, it's not. And all you have to do is know that primitive people actually, and in fact, on the farm we had a 2-holer, which was a bit of an occasion for sociality, if I may say so. that people did not have this particular kind of fastidious response. Now, I use that example because I once heard a very renowned biologist say, it must be in the genes that we prefer to defecate in private. Nuts. So what we have to be very careful of is inferring things that must be in the genes on the basis of our very powerful intuitions. Where do those powerful intuitions come from? Well, Greg Burns has already given us a clue about the role of the reward system in generating powerful intuitions. Now, the hypothesis that I want to explore is that, as indeed Darwin realized, sociability is a basic value for social mammals. And I'm going to restrict myself to talking about mammals because I think it's very clear that the evolutionary history of social insects is completely different from the evolutionary history of social mammals. In between insects and mammals are reptiles, and by and large, they are not social. And one of the things we want to understand is, why is it that mammals are social? And we essentially all are social, at least to some minimal degree, about which I'll have a little bit more to say. The hub of the story, but let me say it's only the hub, is this very, very ancient peptide oxytocin. Oxytocin is found in all vertebrates. It has simply been put to rather new uses in the case of social mammals. And I must emphasize, because there's a lot of nonsense talked about oxytocin as the cuddle molecule and the moral molecule and so forth. Try not to get trapped into that. It's just a peptide. Augmented by the reward system and the really pioneering work that's been done by Greg Burns and Reed Montague and others on the reward system is, I think, at last opening doors that have been closed to us for so long. And finally, the hypothesis recognizes the importance of prefrontal structures. They are huge in humans. It remains contentious whether they are proportionally larger in humans than other primates. But in absolute terms, there is no question but that humans have a heck of a lot of neurons and many, many more in prefrontal structures in terms of sheer numbers than do chimpanzees and bonobos and baboons, for example. And that's just, of course, a picture of oxytocin. So how does this get to morality? The idea is that attachment and trust, which you will see are linked to circuitry involving oxytocin, attachment and trust in mammals, and possibly in social birds, are the platform for moral values. So by platform, I don't mean anything specific, like if you put me in a room, I'm going to cooperate with Paul Kurtz. I don't mean anything that, I mean, I might, but I don't mean anything that specific. Secondly, they are the dispositions that contour what I call problem space. Now, it's just very useful for many concepts in neuroscience to think of them in terms of parameter spaces. And a problem space is really just a parameter space wherein live a variety of kinds of problems, such as resource distribution, conflict reconciliation, whether to attack the neighbors, and so forth. And some solutions to problems are never considered by us. And that's because of the way our social dispositions contour, shape, mold problem space. And finally, attachment and trust, I think, are the motivations that we have to find solutions to social problems, especially when those social problems are ones that involve individuals in our group. Okay, so that's the basic backfill. Social problem solving, it gets better and better if you have a bigger and bigger PFC. But of course, social problem solving is something we see in all social mammals, whether it's wolves or elephants or baboons. Social problem solving is something that all animals do. Now, and they do not do it in a sort of automatic or reflexive way. And of course, the other thing about the PFC is we think that it's important in ways that are clearly not well understood at this point in suppressing impulses and in planning. How exactly that happens, much remains to be discovered. And finally, we think that the larger cortex plays a very important role in tracking reputations. If I'm a social animal, it's very important for me to know what kind of guy this is, whether he's irascible or generous, whether if I cooperate with him, he'll cheat on me, and so forth. Now, we are certainly not the only animals that have hippocampi. We are not the only animals that track reputations. Everyone who has a dog knows how amazingly efficient they are at tracking reputations. Give one dog at Dog Beach a biscuit, he will remember you forever and be back there for that biscuit. Okay, culture, of course, is extremely important, and I should probably really have Greg Burns on the top of the list. I didn't actually put neuroscientists here on this list, but it's just to recognize that there are many cultural historians, many anthropologists who are doing work that is extremely helpful to giving us the understanding of cultural variability and the role that culture plays in providing scaffolding within which we are allowed to have certain kinds of intuitions and impulses. Hume understood, as well as anybody before or after him, the importance of cultural institutions in providing the structure within which you can navigate social space. So those institutions provide certain kinds of ways of thinking about what's going to work or not work, what's right or not right, what's acceptable and what's not. And it's when those institutions break down, or it's when you run an experiment in the absence of those institutions, that you see all kinds of very peculiar things come forth. So I think one of the great all-time experiments in psychology was Philip Zimbardo's prison experiment at Stanford. And it was great because he realized that if you take completely away all of the social institutions, all of the familiar things for these students, and put them in a completely new context, that you cannot predict what they will do. Of course, now we can. We can predict that they will behave in ways that will shock them when they see it later. Now, here's a kind of background point, and it's going to seem a little bit hokey at first, but it's an essential background point because missing it means that you end up sort of in a part of epistemological space where there's nothing but dead ends. Okay, so in about the 1960s, Eleanor Rosch made a discovery, and this has been taken up by philosophers such as Mark Johnson, but also psychologists and linguists. And her basic point was this, that all of our workaday concepts appear to have a radial structure, by which she meant that they have cases at the center that are prototypes for all of us in some group or other. And these concepts have fuzzy boundaries. They don't have sharp boundaries. And what that means is that there are cases out here where, well, it could count as the thing or not. And then in between, with declining degrees of similarity, are other cases. And in that sense, the concepts have a radial structure. And the famous example, of course, is vegetable. But you can do this with all kinds of examples. So carrots are a prototypical vegetable. It's what all children learn in the West anyway, learn is a vegetable. And if you ask a big room of undergraduates, what's the first vegetable that comes to your mind? About 90% will say carrot. And then there's radishes. Well, they're a way outside of the prototype. So some people think they're vegetables, other people think they're garnishes, some people think, well, it's nothing at all. And then finally, way out on the fuzzy boundary, you have wild mushrooms. Well, you might find them in the grocery section of your supermarket. So isn't that criterial for being a vegetable? Well, no. So The interesting thing about the fuzzy boundaries is that there may be no right answer to whether or not that really is a vegetable. And one of the things I think that, and Paul Kurtz, I think, was onto this many, many years ago. One of the things that has really troubled much of modern moral philosophy is that they're arguing about cases out at the periphery. They're essentially arguing about whether parsley is a vegetable. And it doesn't matter. Or it may be that there is no right answer to the question of whether parsley really is a vegetable. Now, there's two other things that are important about this that often, I think, go unremarked for the revolutionary understanding it provides. One is that, and I think George Lakoff picked up on this immediately, is that it suggests that a whole lot of pattern recognition, which essentially involves all of the things we ever do in life, pattern recognition is analogical reasoning. It's seeing a wholly new case and relating it to a prototype from from a category, some category or other. We do this not just for things like boats and vegetables, we do it also for events. This is wife beating, we might say, because we see a certain event happening, and by analogy, we see it as an instance to a prototype we think we understand. So here's another example to show you that how you link to the prototype takes you either into one part of conceptual space or into another part. So when 9/11 happened, many people either said, they went by analogy, either to the prototype of Pearl Harbor, or they went to the prototype of the Oklahoma City bombing, or they went somewhere else. If they went to the prototype of Pearl Harbor, then it was very much, we have to go to war against these guys. If they went for a different prototype, notice now you're in a very different conceptual space, and that means brain space, then you would have a wholly different set of intuitions, a wholly different set of associations and connections. Analogical reasoning is one of the most profound things that we do that hugely influences our choices. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. I can't imagine functioning without it. But the fact that analogical reasoning is so profound essentially falls out of the Roche decision. And many psychologists, including Deirdre Gentner, for example, have explored this. The other thing, and I think Mark Johnson, a philosopher, recognized this also, which is that the categorical radial structure applies also to things in the moral category, to who is a friend, what it is to be honest, what it is to be generous or mingy, what it is to be truthful, and indeed what it is to be either moral or not moral. These are radial concepts. And so that we have prototypes of what's moral, and we have prototypes of what's not moral, and by analogy, we go one direction or we go another. Since many people have tried the idea of defining moral, I think once you recognize that it's really a radial category, you can see that defining it in the way that you would maybe define phosphorylation, right, as adding a phosphate group to an organic molecule. That's not something you're going to be able to do here. Now, the other thing is, here are a bunch of dwellings. And they represent different prototypes for different cultures. And that's the other important thing that comes out of this then. This might be a prototype in Oregon. This is a prototype in Nunavut. And this was on the prairie in the 1930s. My husband's mother grew up in one of those. And I guess William and Harry, that would be the prototype. In any case, the point is then that just as with dwellings or with boats, there are going to be cross-cultural differences. So with morality. And so we're going to see differences, sometimes quite strong, sometimes rather small differences between what counts as honest or okay in one culture versus another. And I think that too makes us think very differently, but in particular, once you've taken that step, then the project of much 20th century moral philosophy of finding an exceptionalist rule, like maximizing aggregate utility, that applies to all cases in all circumstances, is just nuts. Can't possibly work. All right, so now it's time. That was the preliminary. And now I want to go straight into the hypothesis and say a bit more. So I think the deepest level of value, and this obtains for all animals, all organisms, is that circuitry that is organized so that the animal survives, so that it sees to its own warmth, food, reproduction, water, and so forth. And that circuitry, of course, we think of as the circuitry for homeostasis in the case of mammals. It's less well understood in the case of insects, but clearly there is a natural selection explanation for why that circuitry is there. Now, what happens then with mammals? And the answer is something very different begins to occur. So, about several 100 million years ago, amongst the reptiles appeared the sauropsids. And the sauropsids were warm-blooded. Now, this is fundamentally then a story about energy and finding a niche. What's so great about being warm-blooded if you live among a bunch of cold-blooded critters? And the answer is, they're lying around at night when it's cold. Dinner, right? There they are, kind of helpless, kind of cold. And I, warm-blooded thing that I am, can just go and partake. The other thing that's very nice about being warm-blooded is that you can go into environments where the cold-blooded creatures can't. And so we can find new habitats. The downside, and here's where the energy cost comes in, the downside is that sort of gram per gram, a warm-blooded animal has to eat 10 times as much. And that means that on a given patch of territory, many fewer warm-blooded animals can be supported than cold-blooded animals. So what happened? Well, pretend I'm Mother Nature. So Mother Nature says to herself, well, if the sauropsids are going to have fewer offspring, what they need to do is invest more heavily in those offspring. They need to make sure that those offspring do well. And if they're going to do that, and if they are going to venture into new territories, they also need to be born quite immature. Because if you're immature, your brain is not up and running. You can't, I think I've got this on the next slide. Here's the turtle, it comes out of the egg, it's up, it's running, it goes into the water, food is there. Now, on the other hand, if you're a baby rat or a chimpanzee, your brain is very, very immature. Well, what good is that? The good that it is that that immaturity allows for the possibility of tuning yourself up to the local environment. And the local environment is both social, because there's your mom, and it's also physical. And so the capacity to learn from the environment came out of this, and it's a very important and of course it's not that reptiles can't learn, of course they can. It's just that mammalian brains are astonishing learners. So how did I, as Mother Nature, manage this feat of doing something really quite stunning, and that is bringing it about that I don't just care for my warmth, food, threats, and water. I have to care for theirs. And the answer is essentially by extending the ambit of myself to include that. So it's me and mine. And I did it, clever Mother Nature that I am, by rewiring the brain in such a way as to ensure that there was attachment between me and offspring, but also between offspring and me. And here's how it worked. When there's separation, I get anxious in just the way that I get anxious if I see a threat to myself. I get anxious, the baby squeals, that makes me feel terrible. I get the baby, and now I get a flood of oxytocin, all feels good, or at least all feels safe. And so the fundamental old circuitry of pleasure and pain that ensures that an animal sees to its own survival and well-being and can make decisions between priorities, that old circuitry gets pushed into and expanded into a completely new thing. And this is the huge genetic change that accounts for what we think of as the capacity for altruism and for cooperativity. And so you can begin, given that framework, to look at differences amongst social mammals, some of which show long-term pair bonding, some of which do not, and see quite different kinds of ways in which small genetic changes could account for behavior. I should say only about 5% of mammals show long-term pair bonding, but about 95% of birds do. Bird brains are not as well understood as mammalian brains, and we don't know whether the sociality seen in birds and the long-term pair bonding seen in birds is a matter of convergent evolution or what. But suffice it to say that we see all kinds of sociality in mammals, but only in some do we see long-term pair bonding. Beavers do long-term pair bonding, so there's another example of a rodent. But it seems to be quite tightly linked to the particular ecological conditions that they have. All right. So what does oxytocin actually do? And several things seem to be, have emerged in the last 10 years about oxytocin and the interactive effects with other molecules. One is that there seems to be a kind of opposition between stress hormones and oxytocin. So as stress hormones go down, oxytocin levels go up. And it may be that that's one of the interactions. We also see an interaction between an area that Greg Burns talked about that is associated with negative feelings, and that's the amygdala. And so neurons that project to the amygdala carry or release oxytocin, down-regulating the amygdala. They also down-regulate the autonomic system and mean that you're less vigilant, less anxious, less wary, and so you're able to relax amongst friends. And the thought is that probably quite a lot of cooperative behavior can be seen to be explained in terms of this sort of safe, this feeling of everything is okay, and cooperation can emerge quite naturally out of that, as can various kinds of attachment, for example, to friends. So it may be, and this is not known, but it may be that you don't need any special module or any special gene in order for this to happen, and that, again, depending on the ecology and the particular problem-solving strategies used by a mammalian brain, you may see one or other kind of behavior. Now, Bill had a cheesy slide, and this is my cheesy slide, but it actually has an important message. So this is an orang who is in a rescue center in Iowa, and as most of us have learned that in Sumatra and elsewhere, orangs are loners. The mom takes care of the baby, but they don't socialize in groups in the way that, say, chimpanzees do. So here he is, and one day along comes this dog who's also a loner, and they find each other, and they bonded. And they've essentially been together ever since. And you can see these very natural social behaviors. They're not staged. Now, what's the point of this? Well, it partly relates to Steven Pinker's new book, and it partly relates to these comments I made earlier about the importance of institutions. And that is, given changes in the ecological conditions or in the institutions that structure our expectations and our predictions, very different behaviors can emerge. And so when it is sometimes claimed that, of course, in humans, it's absolutely essential for males to know the paternity of their wife's pregnancy, well, it depends. In some cultures, it doesn't really matter because there is no property to bequeath. Nobody really cares. And so that takes us back, of course, again, to the issue about having very strong intuitions and then reading those intuitions back in science. Not always the best plan. And I think I'm getting a signal from James. And so I think there are many questions I haven't really addressed properly or thoroughly here, but I would be happy to take questions.
Questions from the group?
I think, yeah, just before you, and then you. Yes.
In your discussion, you are talking about the behaviors. This is the example right here that I have a question about. If you consider perception and communication in these behaviors, the orangutan, the dogs have some perception of each other, and there's some sort of communication there. The perceptions, you could say, have a breadth of perceptions in terms of subjects and a depth in terms of the intimacy of the perception. And the motivational mechanisms are in this behavior are studied in terms of the brain. But is there any study being done of the categories of the perceptions and the categories of the kinds of communications in terms of the breadth and depth of the perceptions?
You mean in non-human animals?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's tremendous amount of work done by both anthropologists with captive animals and anthropologists in the field. I think there's a lot we don't know, so I don't really know how to answer that. But bear in mind that the brains of all mammals are very, very similar. So your brain may contain more neurons than a rat brain, but you don't have any structures that the rat brain doesn't have. You just have more. Now, it might be that there is, I mean, out of all of that connectivity, because there's more, you can get qualitative differences. So obviously, the fact that we have many more neurons and much more connectivity probably is what explains why humans have a capacity for language, say, or have a capacity for envisaging the future. But all that means is, as in neuroscience, as in elsewhere, we know that out of quantitative differences, you can get qualitative differences. Yeah, I think there was someone in the front row who had a question.
Thank you. I am a neuropathologist. I didn't have a chance to look into the psychology side of science all these years. It's very revealing that I recall the pregnant pituitary.
Yes.
The posterior part of the pituitary produces oxytocin,
Correct.
vasopressin. It
Yes.
helps with the expression of milk and contraction of
Absolutely.
uterus and so on. So bonding is coming from
yes.
there is
Yes.
so interesting.
Yes.
And the mothers, and it shrinks after the
Yes.
mother, the baby finish
After weaning.
feeding and all that. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the father's brain pituitary also swells. I have never seen, but I
Yeah.
have seen about.
No, you're
pregnant-
quite right, and I usually have a slide actually of a lactating female with the infant, and there are also data indicating that oxytocin expression as well as continued development of oxytocin receptors depends on the sort of closeness and the cuddling and the nurturing on the part of the mom. That's been done in rats. And so there are also then human studies. Now, it's much less definitive, but the human studies did this, for example, compare a group of humans who had a normal upbringing, these are females actually, with a group of females who had a very abusive and neglected upbringing. And they looked at oxytocin levels and did not and found quite a significant difference. The normals were much higher. Having said that, now I'm on to my favorite hobby horse, which is much of the research measuring in humans oxytocin levels by taking plasma is unreliable. Because unreliable methods have been used. And that's about to change, but it hasn't changed yet. So I just want to say that I think that study is very interesting. I just don't know if it's real. Yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned that oxytocin goes up when stress levels go down, and I assume, or I'm thinking in terms of cortisol.
That's it.
And I'm wondering, first of all, is there like a total between the two? Is there always,
Yeah.
did they add up to 100? And could it be, I'm trying to decide if one is the cause or.
It's not known.
Okay.
It's not known, but I will say that because there are connections between oxytocin-producing neurons and autonomic centers in the brain stem, that's a place where people are looking. But yeah, that's not known at this point, and it's very wise. You're absolutely right to raise that question and wait and see. Yeah.
So you discussed kind of the underlying principles that seem to govern some of our social structures, and I was just wondering how far the science has gone in kind of applying these very kind of micro-level discoveries to the macro level, even as big as conflict resolution in the developing world and in international development and those sorts of things.
Yeah, that is such a beautiful question. And here I guess I just sort of have to be embarrassed because this is really just science. And I don't think that anything we've found out, I mean, and here I probably differ with Sam Harris, I don't think neuroscience is going to tell us how to solve moral problems at all. I think that it's very salutary to see what probably are the origins, because I think that is an important part of kind of softening people's ideological fervor, shall we say. But I don't think there's any fact, really, that will come out of neuroscience that will answer certain moral issues, about whether inheritance laws are fair. I mean, I don't think so. Or whether a flat tax would be better than a graduated income tax. I don't think so. And those are really, really important questions. I think where we are culturally is at a place where certain kinds of, as it were, sexy moral issues, the ones that are discussed in Philosophy 101 about trolleys running over people and pushing fat men to save the trolley, and those aren't the problems we're facing. We're facing problems where you actually have to know something. And where changing the institutions this way and that way are going to make a huge difference to people's lives. And so I take very seriously things that are currently under study in the law, for example, but also within political science with regard to such issues as owner donation and so forth. But these might not capture the excitement of the undergraduate in the way that the trolley problem, unfortunately, in my view, because it's a ridiculous problem. I've never encountered anything like it, quite honestly, in my life.